Hello and welcome back to Searching for Political Identity. I'm your host, Brian Escow. This is a podcast where I try to figure out for real, do I want to keep voting for Democrats like I always have, or am I ready to try something different? I've got a great show for you today. It's a 2-hour conversation I just had with this gentleman named Reid Kane, who's really informed about politics and history. He's a Marxist, and what he spends most of his time and energy on when he spends it talking politics is talking to fellow Marxists, trying to tell them why they're not seeing the ideology clearly, trying to clear house internally, so to speak, so that eventually outsiders can have a more clear, accurate understanding of Marxism. Isn't that interesting? So, what is Marxism? If you want to know, or if you want to get a better understanding of it, stick around. So, very pleased to be sharing this episode with you. Now, the reason I'm bummed, I don't know if you can sense that deep down, I'm a little bummed, is that before I let that conversation play, I do have to make a very terrible announcement. And that is the host of Not a Real Podcast, Chris Bootleg Darnell, has apparently died, okay, in a very sudden and unexpected way. That news was published by his fiance yesterday on X. And so if you're hearing it for the first time from me, I'm so sorry that I have to be the bearer of bad news. But I just want to give my deepest condolences to Susie and everyone else who is in Bootleg's life. It's a tremendous loss. And so maybe that's all that needs to be said. So thinking about you, Susie, and will be for quite some time. Okay, in other news about this podcast, it's going well. I've always managed to get great guests. It's been a source of pride for me for these entire 3 years, and I'm continuing to land great guests. But things are opening up for me. Opportunities are opening up for me to be a guest on other people's podcasts. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, literally, because what value does someone who is searching for political identity bring to a podcast? I mean, I'm just a question asker. I'm Tucker Carlson. I'm just asking questions. I'm not ready to be a guest, man, but nonetheless, it's happening tomorrow night live on the Larry Sharp YouTube channel. So excited to be there. I hope I don't destroy any credibility that I have, if I have any. And I hope I don't make too big of a fool of myself. Excited for that, actually. So yeah, things are happening. Everything is good. I'm in an extremely grateful place. My girlfriend is amazing. My dog is amazing. I got great friends. In time, I'll open up to you about my family situation, but I've got a lot of love and support. So it's all good. But everything is good, guys. Okay. Like maybe on a solo episode, I'll go a little deeper about my personal life. But for now, suffice to say, I'm in a great place. So thank you for being here. And check out this conversation and have a great rest of your day. And I'll see you next time, okay? Appreciate you. Bye. Welcome on, Reid. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, been looking forward to this since, what has it been, only a week or 2 weeks since you did Brent's Aiming Up podcast?
It was a week or two ago.
Yeah, whenever it was, I saw it right away. And immediately realized that I needed to have you. So I'm poaching. Thank you, Brent.
Oh,
Brent.
sure, he's happy to oblige.
Yeah, he's a very nice guy. I met so many nice people since starting this project, which is to find my political identity, find out what is the proper role of government, what is the best way to organize a society. Found myself asking this question during law school, during the pandemic, during the Trump era, while studying critical race theory. Okay.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yes. Yeah, no, really. And it was really something. We could get into that later.
Yeah, I'd be curious.
Yeah. I'll tell you about it in due time. Well, the short version is the material was controversial, but stimulating, but the students were even more controversial. And we can get into that a little more. But so that environment caused me to finally reflect and ask if I really understood why I always voted for Democrats. Was it really anything more than just what I thought would make my dad proud, and so on. By the way, I got an uncle who worked, he's a highly respected progressive thought leader, writer, broadcaster, was a third hire on Bernie Sanders' 2016 run. So that's the family I come from. So was I voting for Democrats just because they did? And I found, embarrassingly, that I really didn't know as much as I thought I did. So then this project started. So very happy to talk to you, who I know from that interview that I listened to is very well read. And so let me start by this. What caused you to be so interested in learning about history and politics?
Good question. Well, I it really goes back to when I was very young, when I was about 16, 17 years old. I I guess I was a pretty thoughtful kid. And something that something that had sort of I got a kind of a pebble in my shoe when I was young that that I that had been sort of bothering me as I got older. It was a couple of different things. I grew up in kind of like a kind of middle class family. Not very, not like affluent, but we weren't like hard up exactly. I think my parents maybe struggled for a little while when I was young. But by the time I was kind of cognizant of the world, we had a pretty decent life. Safe town, good school.
Same here. Good.
And but something that I heard many times, and you probably did, I think we all hear this, or at least when I was younger, this was a common thing to hear, was you should be grateful for what you have, because there are people that are a lot less fortunate than you all over the world, and all over the country for that matter. So I heard that, during like, food drives and stuff like that. And, that just always kind of struck me as a little odd, but whatever. And then I remember one day, I don't know how old I was. I think I was in the car with my parents, and there was like a news broadcast on the radio that mentioned something about Cuba, I think it was. And I think I like asked, I don't remember exactly what it was talking about, but I asked my mom, about it, like what was going on. And she said something like, well, Cuba is not a free country. So there's people there that are, struggling for their freedom, whereas we live in a free country. So we don't, have to deal with that. Or, so this idea that there were like, for one thing, there are people worse off, which, whatever, but that there were unfree countries was a very, very strange idea to me. I always took, I always took pretty, took to heart kind of like the basic patriotic ideals that are instilled in, I don't know if they still do this today. I get the impression that it's a lot less common than it used to be, but, that are instilled in you from, childhood, through school and popular culture and so on. In terms of like the values that this country, United States, was founded on. And so on. I was actually born on the 4th of July. So that was kind of, Independence Day was always really important to me. So I don't know, that just got in my head. And like, what does that mean that there are countries that are not free and so on? So when I was 16, I think it was, I got my first job, not working for my dad's company, at a little bookstore in a strip mall, this kind of thing that doesn't exist anymore anywhere, I'm pretty sure. Like a very small independent, it was like a small local chain on Long Island.
You might as well say you rode dinosaurs.
Really. And it literally, there were never any customers. Like there was barely anyone there. And I was 16 years old. I worked alone almost all the time. Like there was no one else there with me. So it was a very bizarre experience, but it left me a lot of time. There was no work to do, really, very little work to do. So I spent a lot of time just kind of walking around and looking at the books. And, I was a bit of a reader already. And they had a philosophy section, which I didn't know much about philosophy, but I was curious. And so I started looking at some of the books, and I picked up one of them and started reading a kind of overview of the history of philosophy. And it was interesting, but I got to this section on Hegel and Marx, which really fascinated me. And basically what fascinated me, the way it was presented in this book, was that both Hegel and Marx sought to essentially comprehend the whole arc of human history in a way that made sense of it. as a kind of an overarching story of
That's
the,
already interesting.
yeah.
That's
And so
already interesting.
that's interesting. And, that's in Hegel in particular. And then when it came to Marx, the twist that Marx, supposedly gives to this idea is that there is, it's the same idea, the same story, but the kind of ending of the story, like in the present, is if you will, it's kind of a cliffhanger, right? In the sense that the story isn't over. There's like another chapter, some kind of fundamental event, some kind of fundamental change is imminent, is on the order of the day. And so I read more. I kept reading other books. I read other things by Marx. Hegel was very hard to understand, so I didn't really read a whole lot of Hegel at this point. But I ended up going to college and studying philosophy to learn more about that stuff. So that's kind of how it all started. It was very much a kind of an intellectual curiosity, but it all ties back to that kind of uneasy feeling I had when I was growing up, because it made me think, well, this like the American Revolution, it's not like that's something that happened in the past and it's over.
Right.
We're living in it.
Right.
And in that sense, what is it, how is my destiny sort of, not me as an individual, but how are our destinies as the people that are living in the present?
What are we to do?
What are we to do? How are we going to be part of the story?
Right.
And what does that have to do with the way the world is? Because if there are people that are not free, that seems wrong, and if they're, hungry, that's wrong too. But I was always more concerned with freedom than anything else. So
That's so interesting. Yes. And so we share, and so many people presumably share this concern. It starts with almost like a childlike concern for fellow humans and say, wait a minute, that's just a basic sense of right and wrong. Childlike in the best sense.
It was that. And it
go
was
ahead.
also, but it was also about understanding it,
And so I was just going to say,
yeah.
you took your intellectual curiosity and immediately fed it. And so that's why you're a great guest for the show. And that's why I'm so excited to talk to you. Whereas truthfully, and it hurts to say this, I suspended my intellectual curiosity for far too long. That's just the truth. And so that's why I'm 34 years old, searching for political identity. And so glad to have you here. So wow, what an interesting beginning to the conversation.
Well,
So,
Brian, this society doesn't exactly encourage intellectual
well,
development. At
I'd
least,
love to blame society.
no, I
I'd
mean,
love to blame society.
I'm not
And
blaming.
let's do it.
I'm not blaming society so much as just saying, you're born into the circumstances you're born into, and you don't get to choose them. And I don't think that the circumstances that we live in particularly favor this sort of intellectual development. And to the extent that it does, I think it usually leads in the wrong direction, honestly.
So we're here now, and I'm extremely glad to be here now. So hopefully you're going to help me understand basic terms, basic definitions, and what you think is the best way to organize society. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of libertarians, and the idea that I get. So it's interesting how politics and economics are they two sides of the same coin? Well, they're certainly interrelated. So talk about something that I'm not familiar with that I need to get read up on is economics. But from the libertarians that I talk to, you get the basic idea. The structure here of this political philosophy is, hey man, the state, the government itself is a parasitic entity. It's coercive. Taxation is theft, and it harms the market. And the market, or as you've referred to it, commercial activity, is great, but it can only do so much. So who's right? Is the market sufficient to take care of all of our needs? Because we all want, I'd like to think that all people generally want people to flourish and be well. So it's a matter of how you get there and a difference of opinion. So tell me, what do I need to know about the market, these terms, the role and need for a government? What's going on here? How do you want to begin?
Yeah, it's a mess. It's a very complicated set of questions. And what makes it even more complicated is that there are very different perspectives on not just kind of how to answer that question, but even what the words you're using mean,
Right.
And because, of course, the meanings of words change over time, but they don't just change arbitrarily. Like, there's reasons why they change the way they do.
Hmm. Hmm.
My personal feeling, and what I try to do more than anything else, is that uh, I think it's really important to understand the historical context in which we live, and not that other perspectives don't engage with the history, but I definitely think there's a tendency to disregard different perspectives on this history as if one is simply right and one is simply wrong. And, I'm not saying that there's everything is relative or something like that, but I think you have to understand where these different perspectives come from, why they are plausible to people, and why, say, my perspective, might not be plausible to somebody else. These things don't come out of nowhere. There are reasons that these different ways of looking at things developed that are part of that history. So that makes it even more complicated.
Mm.
But the only way you can really deal with that level of complication is to take it on and try to untangle it. So I am very resistant to something I think is very common, and it's tempting to see it as a very kind of contemporary problem that, say, is bound up with like social media or whatever. And it is, but it also is a very old problem that has just appeared in different forms over different periods of time. And the problem I'm talking about is this tendency to kind of um I mean, you could put it like black and white thinking, like
Yeah.
oversimplifying
Yeah.
things, treating things in terms of very sort of abstract oppositions without asking what's underlying those different,
Mhm.
those differences. So I'm very interested in talking to people that do not agree necessarily with the things that and I'm not out here like espousing what society needs to do, what people need to believe. I have my perspective that I certainly think is correct, but I'm not like trying to say this is right and this is wrong, so much as this is superficial. It's not dealing with X, Y, and Z. It's just taking for granted that, um, that, say, it's taking for granted what the market, what the term, what is the market. It has a particular perspective on that, that it's unwilling to, say, given, say, the libertarian perspective, and there are various different strains within libertarianism. But there's a perspective on the market there that I don't think is wrong. I think it gets at certain truths, but I think it's also based on certain oversimplifications as well.
Mhm.
So
Mm.
I'm more interested in seeing how these different positions developed and bringing that into the discussion, as opposed to just being like my side versus your side.
Take what's good from anything.
And, well, but also to see like why why these different perspectives emerge. Like, they emerge in response to actual
Mhm.
historical problems,
Right.
and they develop and change as those problems develop and change. So, there are, good things, so to speak, in various different positions, and true things in various different positions, but it's not so much for me a matter of taking the good parts and leaving the bad parts aside, as it is understanding why people have this whole perspective that they have,
Mm.
and kind of developing relationships with people where they're willing to think a little bit more deeply about what they believe and why they differ from other people, and what they take for granted, and whether or not they really should, or whether or not they should think more deeply about the foundations of their own position. So I know it maybe sounds a little wishy-washy, but look, I'm like one person. A single individual can't really do anything politically. You need Politics is all about the group, on for better or
Yeah,
worse.
what one person believes versus how you're gonna make that happen is a whole nother conversation.
So the best thing I feel like I can do as an individual is to speak, to say what I have to say in a manner that provokes, conversations or thought or reflection that might, um, I don't know, help clear things up in a way that they're very unclear in general right now. So,
Well, it's perfect that you're here. So we have to understand the history. And look, your appearance on Aiming Up, you gave the whole thing. You don't need to regurgitate
well,
it here.
yeah, and there's actually a lot more to it as well, but I'm not necessarily looking to go into like the
Yeah.
full
So
extent
what is
of that.
so what is, sure, and I wouldn't want you to, but what is the point that we emerge from history, like Kamala Harris says, no one here is just here, everyone comes from something, but the point remains, as much fun as we could have at her for the way she speaks or the way she gets clipped in the media and made fun of, maybe it's unfair, but the point remains that we're emerging from the past. So let me ask you this. Do you think today do you think Marxism is relevant today? And maybe by way of that question, you can help me understand what it means.
Yeah. So, well, to the extent that it's relevant in a bad way. Let me put it that way. So why do I say that? Marxism. So first, this is another one of those things where when somebody says Marxism, they already have an idea of what that means, right? And where do they get that idea? Did they get it from reading Marx? Maybe they read maybe you
Probably Fox.
well,
Fox News.
Fox News. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
more likely than anything, it's from like mainstream discourse, or
Right.
maybe like some sort of academic engagement, or maybe they've read a little bit more deeply. Maybe they've read something from Marx, but like Marx was writing in a very different world in a lot of respects than the world we live in.
Mm.
Most I mean, he's taking for granted the entire world he lives in. He's taking for granted the people, the events of the day, the concerns of the day, the organizations, the things people are saying, the positions people are taking. He has a whole world in mind, and he's not writing for people 150 years in the future. He's
Hmm.
not. He's writing for his moment. He's writing for people that already know what he's talking about,
Mm.
really. And for the most part, like overwhelmingly, the historical reference points that he's taking for granted are just completely unknown today, or reduced to very, very crude caricatures. But for the most part, just completely unfamiliar. So people think like Marx came up with the idea of communism or something, which is not accurate, not
Mm.
even close to accurate. He enters into a movement that's already very developed, very expansive, very diverse, very complex, that spans Europe. It's not like he came up with this idea. He's only really in a position of significant notoriety within like the last decade and a half of his life. So, what is Marxism?
What is
It
communism?
what
Maybe
is
before that.
communism? There's a lot of these questions,
Right.
and I think part of the problem is where people are getting their information on this. They're getting it from sources that, again, they might have a little piece of truth here or there, but for the most part, they're not really taking seriously the subject matter that they're
Hmm.
they're kind of paraphrasing or abbreviating.
Hmm.
So that's a very difficult starting point, because people already have all these assumptions
Yeah.
that I can explain. For the most part, I can probably explain where you got that idea of what Marxism is. But that's a huge conversation
Right.
unto
It's like someone
itself.
sticking their hand in the ocean, grabbing a fish and saying, explain everything about the ecosystem the fish lives in. It's like, well, there's a whole ocean. I mean, you just grabbed one fish. Shoot.
So let me say this, and part of the problem also is, generally, if you're learning anything about Marxism today from anyone else, you're either getting it from people that are decidedly opposed to it, whatever they think it is, which is the more prominent position, or depending on the circles you're in, people that kind of uphold their idea of Marxism as good, as correct, as like, so people on the left, so to speak, or at least as worthy of some sort of credit, if not wholly correct, right? There's something to it, maybe, but whatever. And frankly, both of those sides are talking about something. They're talking about, so okay, let me put it this way, and I talked about this in more detail on Brent's podcast. But basically, what happened is you already had this socialist movement in the 19th century that was developing decades before Marx was born, um, or within the couple of decades of Marx's birth, but up to the, in the 4 decades before he gets involved, it's been developing. Um, and, you know, it basically collapses. This movement basically collapses in the mid 19th century. There are revolutions across Europe in 1848 that the socialist movement is part of, but they're not leading these revolutions. So most of Europe at the time, the whole continent of Europe, for the most part, was dominated by monarchies, and with based on old-fashioned kind of feudalistic, aristocratic forms of society that had really become very outdated, because what you had for the previous couple centuries is the development of what we would think of as modern society, commercial society. Bourgeois society was the common term
Yeah,
in the
that's an
movement at the
interesting thing
time.
that I took from your conversation with Brent, was that this
Mhm.
birth of commerce. What
Yeah.
is it fair? Is it fair? I mean, I think this is what you said, but is it really the case that at some point commerce sprang into existence and kind of changed humans relate to each other? Or I assume it had been going on forever.
Well, commerce has existed since the dawn of civilization, in the sense of market exchange, we might think of it
Right.
in those terms, or commodity exchange. It has existed, almost as long as, thousands and thousands of years. Some of the earliest writing we have is reckoning of inventories and debts and
Amazing.
things like that.
Yeah.
But what changed is not commerce. Commerce already existed. What changed is the role it played in society, and what the role it played in. And when I say society, I mean what role it played in the lives of all human
Yeah.
beings. For the most part, for most of human history, it played no role at all, because most human beings, from the dawn of civilization. So obviously there's like pre-civilization, there's like hunter-gatherers and so on. But from the rise of civilization, the role of commerce was really the province of the ruling classes. Most human
Mm.
beings were essentially peasants,
Mm. Hmm.
subsistence agriculturalists that lived hand to mouth. Uh, they lived off of the land that they worked. They never left that land. They never went anywhere else. They never saw the world. They never knew anything about the world. They were living something not terribly distant from an animal
I was just
existence,
thinking
or a,
animalistic,
and not to, that's not to like, cast
degrade in any way.
aspersions.
Yeah.
No, it's just the way it was.
Hmm.
And, it wasn't completely animal. I mean, they were human beings and
Right.
everything, but it was very
More
limited.
natural.
Yeah, it was very limited compared to what we would think of as, a kind of fully developed human existence. Very, very limited. And,
Mm.
so to the extent that there
Mm.
was like culture that, comes down to us anyway, or, intellectual development, and so on, and commerce, it was the province of the ruling classes, who lived by, exploiting the labor of the direct producers in one
Mm.
form or another, whether those be peasant producers who might be, who might have to give some sort of tribute or rent to a lord of the land, kind of a warlord that controlled the territory, which is where what we would think of as state power kind of begins. These sort of warlords,
Mm.
or as slaves that are just directly owned outright by
Mhm.
someone that owns what you produce, and then you get, some of it back, or you're allowed to keep some of it for yourself. There's various different forms this takes, but that's what most of human beings knew as life for most of human history. Um, what changes around the 15th century is that commerce stops being simply um, a sort of something sitting on top of this foundation, this much bigger foundation that is the province of a kind of minority, and becomes increasingly integral to the day-to-day life of every human being. Beginning in northwestern Europe, It sort of has its roots in the Renaissance and like the Italian city states in the Renaissance, but that's not really that different from what I was describing earlier. It really changes when England essentially becomes the dominant power in Europe. So it really changes in over the 17th century, and by the 18th century, England is the world power. Established through during the 18th century, it establishes itself as the world power. So that's really what changes, and there's it's a complicated story why that happens, but that's where you get. Now increasingly throughout the world as the influence of European commercial society spreads, you have people are no longer just living off of what they directly produce, what they grow, what they the animals they raise, the things they make for themselves. People are making things to sell and to live by buying the things they need with the money they make. That's
supply chains.
Yeah. And it radically transforms the world. And the best account of this is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which is, I think, should be like kind of required reading for everyone, honestly. But anyway, so that's what changes. Now, in the 19th century, not to make the long story short, but so you have this socialist movement that develops, which does not develop in reaction against commercial society, the market. This is really important. And this is one of the biggest confusions today, is people think capitalism is the word for commercial society, for the market, for exchange, for free enterprise, private property, et cetera, et cetera. No, the term capitalism was coined in the mid 19th century by the socialist movement to refer to a new phenomenon that emerges in the 19th century, which is not commercial society. It's something that emerges out of commercial society.
What is it?
The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, it radically transforms things again.
Very interesting point.
And what changes fundamentally is, instead of having a society where, and up to the 19th century, it's not like everyone was like an independent producer that was producing commodities to sell. That wasn't like everyone. But it was more and more of society was either doing that or aspiring to do that, or in one way or another had to orient toward that activity as the kind of primary economic activity of society. So it's only with the 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution, that this process kind of accelerates through industrialization. So basically, this is where England and Europe more generally not only are kind of dominating the world through trade, but through their ability to outcompete the trade of every other country and every other party to it, through mechanization, through industry, through this radical increase in productivity. Like this is a change that is at least as radical as the change that happens from the 15th to the 17th century, if not more. Arguably, it's as radical as the Neolithic Revolution. The transition from hunter-gatherers to settled agriculture.
I was just going to say, could this rival fire?
It is arguably on that level. And so what is really radically different about this, it's easy to see the technology and think it's the technology, think it's the machines, the factories.
Right.
And of course, that's a big part of it. But the factories, the machines don't exist in isolation. They exist in a social context. And what is the social context they exist in? It's one where the basis of production is increasingly not individual craftsmen, artisans who might have a workshop with some journeymen that work for them, or small farmers that have a family that grow some crops and maybe make some goods to sell on the side in their out back or something. What you have is these large concerns, these large enterprises that are getting bigger and bigger, faster and faster, and crowding out all of their competitors, so that you are very quickly seeing, as industries industrialize, they become monopolized by smaller and smaller numbers of larger and larger concerns. And the other side of it is that the people that are actually depending on commerce, the majority of them are no longer doing so by making things to sell. They're doing it by selling themselves as employees to the people that own the industries, that own the means of industrial production. So wage labor goes from a marginal phenomenon, sort of a temporary situation you might be in on your way to independence,
primary one,
to the primary. So now we live in a world where the overwhelming majority of people are either wage laborers or dependent on the wage labor of their family or what have you, or, they're, essentially unemployed to such an extent that they fall out of society altogether, but they aren't like, rich. The people that own the means of employing the majority are a tiny minority for the most part. Now, there are still some industries, and there always will be some industries where small proprietorship is still viable, but they're a minority, and they're always subject to pressure to the extent that eventually they're going to come for you, so to speak. Eventually you're going to be outcompeted. Eventually Walmart's going to come in and get them, and the mom and pop shops are going to go out of business, or whatever the equivalent would be in a given industry.
So I think you just gave me the keys to the kingdom in terms of understanding the key nuanced distinction between people on the left and people on the right in so many ways when it comes to economics. Let me kind of review and correct me where I didn't get it right. But my libertarian and even anarchist friends, anarcho-capitalists, would say that capitalism is the voluntary exchange and all of that. And you're saying, no, that's not what socialism or communism is critiquing. It's the Industrial Revolution, which is not only this technology, but this consolidation of corporate power and this lack of the average person producing. Wow. I mean,
it's really what
amazing.
It is. What the socialist tradition meant by capitalism up until, say, the early 20th century, where everything goes wrong for all around the table. What they meant was essentially what libertarians call crony capitalism or corporatism,
right?
Or things like that.
Right.
That was just what it meant. And because what is capital? Capital isn't just stuff you sell. Capital is not the market. Capital is money that makes money. That's really what capital is. It comes from, lending money with
it's a way
interest.
It's a way to say the ownership class.
Yes. And so capitalism really referred to that change in commercial society where you suddenly have
consolidation of ownership class.
Right. So with so going back to the emergence of commercial society, there's revolutions, political revolutions that accompany that. Of course, the American Revolution being among the most, important and famous. And a big part of those revolutions was this idea that the common people, what was called at the time in Europe, the third estate. So you have this ruling class that's made up of the estate of the priests, the church, the Catholic Church, the first estate. So they're like they're on top. And then the second estate is the aristocrats, which are like the warriors that are, hold political power. And then the third estate is everyone else, which is the peasants, the artisans, the merchants, the common people, the beggars. All of them are part of this third estate, the common.
This is giving very strong caste vibes.
Yeah, it is a caste system, is exactly, because you're born into it, and you can't. The priests may scoop up like the bright children from the poor villages to become priests, but that's not the same thing as like rising up through your own merits, climbing a ladder. It's a different sort of thing. And you can't become an aristocrat. You just can't until the early modern period where things start to get more fluid. But what you end up having is a series of political revolutions on the part of the third estate, the common people, the nation, against the rulers. In order to basically say, look, we make everything. We are the source of all the wealth in society. We are society. The common people, we are society. We are, and the priests, have their role, and the aristocrats have their role, but their role is not to be the dominators of everyone else. They should be playing their role So they have their job to do, we have our jobs to do.
Mm-hmm.
They shouldn't be in charge, and they shouldn't be essentially sucking the blood out of society through taxation, through rent, through various different forms of just kind of forcible expropriation
Mm-hmm.
of wealth. So that was what those revolutions was about kind of overthrowing that class system of a ruling class over society. So there's like the working classes, those who work. That's how they referred to the third estate. So there's those who pray, those who fight, and those who work.
Wow.
So those who work, the working classes, the bourgeois classes, especially, which is like the urban, the classes involved in commerce. So not so much the peasants, which the peasantry is sort of starting to dissolve into commercial farming and into proletarian, wage labor. So that's starting to break up. And what you end up having is this class struggle of these rising working classes against the aristocrats for political power. Because they're basically saying, look, we should have a say in how society as a whole is organized in terms of the law, politics, because we are the source of wealth that the ruling classes depend on. So what you get in the mid-19th century to the workers, the industrial workers, the wage laborers that are now stuck in this position where they don't really have any prospects of becoming economically independent anymore. They're kind of stuck for life in this condition of effective slavery as far as they're concerned. And it's not just that they have to work for someone else. I mean, that isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's a good arrangement. The real problem is that there are these periodic crises that throw enormous numbers of people out of work. And when there's a turnaround, it doesn't like absorb all of those people back into the workforce. It just leaves a lot of people to rot. And so then you get rampant alcoholism, crime, prostitution, all of these social defects that are affecting the working classes, their communities, their families, themselves. And even if they're able to get a job, the conditions in these factories are pretty brutal. They can be very brutal. They're pushed to work longer and longer hours. At the peak, you had like 16 to 18-hour days. I mean, imagine that. I don't know, when do you sleep? Not so anyway. You get the idea. There's this sense that there's a new ruling class emerging. We thought we had done away with ruling classes, but now there's like this aristocracy of industry. And really what it is, kind of behind the aristocracy of industry, is an aristocracy of money. That is sort of, the leaders of industry are becoming kind of these money lenders that are essentially just investing in the work other people are doing and then taking their cut without really doing anything in the production process. So that's the way it looks. And so that's where socialism comes from. So now I just want to get back to the original question very briefly. I know I was rambling about a bit
beautiful,
there.
A beautiful ramble.
So that really all comes to grief in the mid-19th century with these revolutions in 1848, where the socialists are on the same side as the liberal Republicans and the Democrats, these kind of like middle class, what we would think of as like lower middle class Democrats that want not just liberal rights, but also democratic representation. The socialists are part of that revolutionary struggle against the remnants of feudalism, against the old aristocracy, against the monarchies, the absolute monarchies. But they have their own demands as well, as in addition to political freedom and equality and democracy, they have their own demands. They have their own ideas. And ultimately what they want is they want to rise to the position of political power themselves, the workers, the working class movement. Because they, as far as they're concerned, it's their labor that makes society function, and they're the majority. So they should have at least some say, but really but the real point is they should, so there's different perspectives in this movement, but generally speaking, the idea is, why shouldn't we be the ones deciding? Considering we're the majority, we're the ones that have to, in these revolutions, we're the ones in the streets with the guns that are, trying to get these despotic regimes to fall. We're the ones putting our lives on the line. So why do we get nothing out of this deal, or why do we get a raw end of the deal? But those revolutions collapse and fail. and the movement really dissolves, or it doesn't completely dissolve, but it sort of disintegrates. And it does come back in the late 19th century. And that's where Marx plays a very crucial role in helping the movement that kind of comes back understand what went wrong and what to do differently. And that's a whole nother question. But essentially what happens is by the early 20th century, this movement is very large, very imposing, and it seems like it's very close to being able to take political power in the most powerful, some of the most powerful capitalist countries, specifically Germany. And I mean, I'm not going to get into the full details of what happens, but 1914, World War I begins. That movement is really kind of disrupted deeply, basically dissolved as an international movement by World War I. And then you get the Russian Revolution. There's kind of this last hope.
Was the purpose of World War I to disrupt that movement, do you think?
So that I think that's arguably the case, and I think there's a very good case to be made for that. That's not like the mainstream historiography, but I think it's kind of I think it personally that it's unquestionably the case that that was, if not the deciding factor, one of the fundamental reasons why that war began. So that's a whole nother story. But Germany, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, was the largest party in the Reichstag at the time, right before World War I starts. But Germany was not a democratic country at the time. It was an empire where the government was completely out of the control of the legislature. The legislature was kind of a fig leaf over despotism. They had a little bit of influence, but ultimately the state, the government, could do whatever it wanted, within, not unlimited in unlimited sense, but they weren't really constrained by what society thought through, as expressed through the legislature. So basically there is this threat being posed. If there's this majority party that claims they're revolutionary, that is dangerous for the regime. So that was a major factor, certainly in what led to the war. But ultimately what ended up happening is the movement collapsed and failed in a moment of severe crisis. That's what ends up happening. And everything that's happened since then, including the formation of the Soviet Union and all the other examples of communist countries or socialist countries that you can enumerate, come out of this failure. They don't really come out of a victory. They come out of a disintegration, a crisis, a failure to respond to that crisis, and a subsequent kind of disintegration and degeneration of the movement. And so then you get people on all different sides arguing that they're the true Marxists, right? So Stalin, the Soviet Union, claims they're the true Marxists. Trotsky is in exile. He's claiming he's the true Marxist. The Social Democrats are still there. They're claiming that they are, maybe not the true Marxist, but they're truer to Marxist spirit or something like that. It's a very complicated, it's a very complicated breakdown, disintegration that only gets more and more complicated and more confused over
fractured
the century that follows up to the present.
Right. So. That's so amazing. So it's all there.
Yeah.
Everything. So, wow. So this idea of socialism, communism, conceptually is the idea that a concentration of power and money in the business ruling class creates social ills for the laborer, for the worker, for the one who gets exploited, and whether it's alcohol, it's just the machine that ultimately does create poverty and sickness is kind of what I'm hearing.
So let me say a little bit more about that, because yes, but there's a very superficial way of looking at that. And that's the way that most people today that consider themselves Marxists would take it, which is a sort of like a moral condemnation of something. So it's as if like, oh, well, this system, this like industrial system or commercial system, however you want to think about it, because I think a lot of libertarians would basically say that's kind of like a false distinction to draw between commercial society and industrial society. I think I think the really good libertarian thinkers understand and appreciate this distinction. But like, if you're talking to libertarians on Twitter or something, or X, no offense, I think highly of a lot of them. I have some very interesting and good conversations, but I think there's a lot that are just as crude in their thinking as most Marxists are, most so-called Marxists are. I don't think they necessarily respect that distinction as like a relevant one, or they don't really see the difference between capital and other forms of property. So like, as far as they're concerned, owning property is the same whether you own a car or a house or clothes or a toothbrush
or a factory,
or a factory that employs thousands of people.
I'm so glad you said that, Reid, because I wanted to say what the libertarians might say, right, is because we're talking about a situation where the average Joe can't climb the ladder, and everyone agrees that the average Joe should be able to climb the ladder. So the libertarian would say, hey, with this technological revolution in industry, all these things happening, the point is it's actually a victim mindset to say that I can't climb the ladder and there's some oppressive system happening to me. But
well, I'm sorry to interrupt, Brian, but that's a really important point, because
go ahead.
Today, that is certainly the way. I mean, if you listen to contemporary so-called Marxists, that's the impression you would get. What it was at the time was very different. What it was at the time was that the working class was trying to compete in the market for a better deal, a better contract, a better, the core of capitalism in the sense that I'm describing is the labor market. It's the market for jobs, for employment. And it's the competition on the one hand between the workers, among the workers for the jobs that are available. So competition between people looking for employment. On the other hand, it's competition among the employers for those employees. And the flip side, namely the market in consumer goods to sell them the things they make. But there's also the competition between the workers and the employers over the terms of employment. So how much are they making? What are the hours? What are the conditions, etc.? And that's really where the struggle, when the term class struggle, in this kind of Marxist rubric, class struggle, that's really kind of the core of where the class struggle develops, is in this commercial competition between the workers and the capitalists. So then the question is, well, what's the problem if can't they just compete?
Right. The libertarian would say, in fact, Dr. Rechtenwald, who's one of several highly respected libertarian thinkers, was a former Marxist. He made this point to me actually on my show. He said that the Marxists believe that you need some entity to negotiate between these labor and capital. And he said, in my wisdom, he said in his infinite wisdom, he's older than you, Reid. Maybe you're going to get there one day. Why is he wrong? Why is that entity needed to negotiate?
Again, well, maybe he shouldn't know better. I don't really know him that well. I've known of him for a while, and I was paying attention when he was harangued out of his job, and which is horrible. And I think it's a horrible thing that happened to him. And I certainly can appreciate why somebody would become totally fed up with this entire, so to speak, side of the political spectrum altogether, because it's really, I mean, let me put it this way, like my opponents, the people that I'm like see myself as criticizing most importantly are Marxists, are other Marxists, or people that think of themselves as Marxists. I really don't care as much about the detractors, except I want them to at least be clear what they're opposing, as opposed to opposing caricatures. That's why I said to you, I'm not trying to convert you or anyone else. I just want to help clarify what is actually at issue.
Which is why you make such an incredible guest. Please go on.
Thank you.
Seriously.
I feel like I lost my train of
thought. An entity between labor and capital.
So yeah, that's certainly what people think Marxism, including what Marxists think Marxism is today. And the entity, namely being the state, or like the party that is aspiring to state power, and then like the party state, the one party state, the totalitarian state, that's kind of the idea, because that is essentially how Marxism was reframed by the Soviet, in the Soviet Union by the Stalin regime to rationalize what they were doing, to basically say, we have justification for this because this is what Marxism is about. It is really, that's just not true. I mean, I could get into that. Is just deconstructing that lie is like kind of another hour's worth of
Well, I'll
stuff
make
to
a
get
note
into.
and maybe we'll do it sometime.
It's not like a lie. It does come out of Marxism, and it comes out of the failure of Marxism. But my point would be, this is not what Marxism was trying to achieve. And in fact, if you're familiar with Marx's political development, you'll know that he was more critical than anything else throughout his life of this tendency in the socialist movement towards what would ultimately become known at the end of the 19th century as state socialism. But what earlier on he referred to by terms like reactionary socialism or imperial socialism, things like this.
Very
So
interesting.
this whole pattern of the state rising above society and essentially holding these struggling classes in such a way that not that the struggle ends, but it doesn't get out of control and lead to like a revolution or something, that essentially like stabilizes this conflict and prevents it from disrupting society. That's what Marx called Bonapartism. And it's a long story why it's referring not to Napoleon Bonaparte, but to Napoleon III, who was the leader of the French. So after the revolution in 1848 fails, the president of the French Republic is this guy Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who is Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, and he basically has a coup d'état and establishes an empire and declares himself emperor. So that's what Marx is talking about. He's talking about this political regime that comes out of the failure of the revolution, where the state essentially becomes a dictatorship over society that exists in order to allow capitalism to continue to develop, but without political liberty, without civil liberty. Essentially, the state, it's like state-controlled capitalist development, essentially. And part of that is like bribing the working class by like giving them state employment.
So you're saying this is a Band-Aid?
Yeah.
You're saying state rising above authoritarian socialism or communism would not actually be Marx's ideal. It's a Band-Aid approach. So how do you resolve? So if that's a Band-Aid, when the point is to resolve the conflict between classes, what was the original vision to resolve it? Or how would you answer that question?
So in the 19th century, you still, as I was saying, you still have all of these remnants of feudal, despotism, of monarchical absolutism, and so on. And so, even in the lead up to 1848, but also afterwards, the idea was, well, we need to get rid of all of this garbage that's from the old, the old world, that's preventing the full development. And this isn't just the socialists that think this. This is what the liberals, the Republicans, the Democrats, all of these different people, they're all basically like, we need to get rid of this stuff. We need to get rid of these encumbrances. We need to have, freedom of speech, freedom of, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of the press. We need to have the right to bear arms, although it was put a little, at the time, the way they thought of it was a little more, so it wasn't just about individuals owning guns in the United States as well as in Europe. It was about replacing standing armies under the control of the centralized government. This is maybe the most important thing, if I can communicate this to whoever's watching. It was about replacing the standing army at the command of the centralized government, so the king, the bureaucracy under the king, etc., with the arming of the people, the general arming of the people in a popular militia.
So you're saying the Second Amendment is a socialist concept?
Well, it's not. I mean, it goes
joking,
back.
But
no, I mean, it's not in the sense that it goes back to like the English Revolution, in the 17th century. But it is a socialist concept in the sense that the socialists were not only for it, but that was kind of fundamental.
Right.
That was way more fundamental than anything having to do with property. I'll tell you that. And it's because socialism, before it was about these economic questions, it was concerned with fully consolidating modern commercial liberal bourgeois society. It was, so basically the idea, Marx's point, and not all the socialists agreed with this. This was something that he fought to convince the movement of,
Mhm.
was that the workers should be siding with the liberals against the state, against this reactionary authoritarian state, in order to achieve the democratic republic, essentially to achieve the same form of government, more or less, that existed in the United States. That was really the goal. Civil liberties were the number one most important thing. So freedom of speech, freedom of the press, association, assembly, because without those, there is no class struggle. Like the workers can't freely associate, then they can't compete in the market for with their employers. The employers have these massive associations. They have these giant enterprises that employ hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people, and not to mention the capital, the money invested in them. They have immense resources, immense organizations. The workers, at best, have like unions, which don't think of what unions are today. Think of something much more primitive than that, that has no support from the state, that is not that is not integrated into like the official mechanisms of the social order or anything like that. Like these are, if they're not explicitly illegal, they're like this close to being banned at all times, or being violently suppressed, which they were constantly. So this idea was, we need to side with the liberals against the state in a revolution for a democratic republic with civil liberties. That was the number one thing.
Why did Marx say the state had to go, or in the way that it was presenting itself, at least at that time?
So this gets back to a point. I think I got sidetracked when I was trying to make it, as happens with me. I'm very
I'm sure I threw you
prone to
off.
tangents.
I'm sure I interrupted you and threw you off.
Well, let me just say one more thing before I get to that, which is the crucial thing was that the working class do this from the standpoint of independent organization. So they needed their own political party, and not just a political party in the sense of like an electoral machine, but like essentially like a kind of organized leadership of this whole social movement that had fundamentally like educational and journalistic functions, as well as all sorts of different forms of social organization. So trade unions, cooperatives, credit unions, mutual insurance, all these different things, various different kinds of recreational, choirs and sports clubs and all different kinds of stuff. It was really an entire society that the workers organized for themselves, and the party was really just like kind of like the top level representative of that movement, and the kind of voice that movement had toward those in power. So like that was the movement essentially saying, we want power because we are society, as again going back to the earlier revolution. So it was very important that though the socialist movement support the liberal kind of the liberals, the bourgeois, so to speak, party in its struggle against the state, it needed to do so from a position of independence, because as soon as this new social order, political order was consolidated, it would very quickly turn against the workers. That was the idea, because that's what had happened in 1848 and also earlier. So they needed to be ready to stand on their own feet, to not be disorganized and so on, and to kind of fight for their own interests through democracy. So the ultimate goal was that the Workers' Party in this democratic republic attract the majority of the people they're trying to represent, to support them and essentially ascend to power as the biggest,
and right the ship and keep the ship going in the right direction, through become the ship.
Right, through the democratic republic. And then the point wouldn't be you use the state to do everything, right? Because what would the state be? It wouldn't be this centralized bureaucratic apparatus of repression that has police forces and military forces,
which is what people want to say communism and Marxism is, but it would be,
because that's what it was in the 20th century.
But what would it be then?
It would be the armed people. It would be the militia, would be the state, the people, the armed. So the idea would basically be every male that's capable of bearing arms would not only have the right to bear arms, but the responsibility, the duty to bear arms, and not just to own a gun, but to be trained, drilled, organized disciplined, not like not like in a Spartan militaristic society, but in the same way that we have like reserve. So we
Right.
have a militia in the United States. It's called
Right.
the National Guard, and there's also state guards as well. Actually, it's 50 different National Guards, but they
Right.
can also be unified into the National Guard at the president's order. So we have that. Of course, it's a minority of people that are in the militia, that are in
Right.
the National Guard.
Wow.
The idea would be essentially that all able-bodied males have a duty to be part of their militias, and those militias are organized in units at the municipal, like at the local level. They're controlled at the local level. They're not controlled from above. They're
Right.
controlled by the people that are in it. They
People's
elect their own
militias. Right.
officers, and the
Mm.
municipality is the source of political organization for them. So that goes back again to the American Revolution. That was the whole concept of the
Right.
American state. The federal government isn't really the state. They are the government of the state. What is the
Right.
state? The state is the people that have the ability to enforce the law. And who would it be in a republic? It would be the people themselves, rather than a special class or caste of armed men serving a minority of society through a bureaucracy. So that was the fundamental thing, was the democratic republic in that sense. And then what you would have after the workers came to power was not everything happening through the state. The state would still have the same kinds of functions it's supposed to have in a democratic republic, like
Right.
enforcing the law, maintaining
Right.
social order.
Right.
But what would really happen is you would have the ability of the working class to organize themselves to compete with the employers on something like an equal playing field, and not even just equal. So this gets back to the other question you had asked. So all of this is not based on like, wouldn't this be good? Doesn't this sound like a good idea? It's based on the idea that society is a natural phenomenon that develops through history. And just like any species in nature, biological species, it evolves and it develops into new forms as its conditions change, if it survives. And you could look at it this as different societies, but also as this kind of whole society. Once you get to after Columbus, you have a single global society, at least in outline, through the world market. And now it really is a global society. So what you really have is this developing phenomenon of society in history. And it develops through these processes of social upheaval, where at a certain point, the economic capacities of society no longer require the same level of like repressive force from above to maintain order. So the old ruling classes are overthrown by the people underneath them. But the way that's always played out before is, well, new ruling classes come about. The difference in that Marx, for example, saw in this latest iteration of this cycle is that with the Industrial Revolution, there is no working class beneath the workers themselves. So if they were in power, if they were the ruling class, then that would be tantamount to ending the existence of classes.
Okay. Hold on. Let's take a pause right there.
That's right.
Yep. I can hear you. We're back. So, wow. So Marx, like any good libertarian, thought the state, well, he didn't think the state was a problem. So libertarians should be able to embrace Marx. I mean, how much difference is there really between a good libertarian and a good Marxist?
So, Marx's whole idea was that the existence of the state is necessary to the extent that ruling classes are necessary. And, ruling classes were economically necessary throughout history if you were going to have like an integrated civilization, right? Before you had civilization, you didn't need them, so you didn't have states. And do we need civilization? Well, it doesn't really matter because it happened. It's just, it's not like we're pro or anti-civilization. It ain't going anywhere. So, it may get really ugly, but it's going to keep coming back, is the idea. So really the question is, why is the state, which seemingly was subjugated to society in the bourgeois revolutions, that's what the republic is, or at least constitutional monarchy is about. if not Republican government, is about. It's about
Hmm.
society is really in power, and the state
Hmm.
is an instrument of society, kind of imposing order on itself. But that seems to not be the way the state is functioning anymore. Um, by the 19th century. Well, first of all, because the state doesn't even have that character in most of the world, certainly not in most of Europe. But even in England, which is like the one civilized or civilized in the sense of like bourgeois civilization, country in Europe, certainly the most powerful. United States is a little different. It's a little complicated because, well, that's another story.
But
But
is the idea that the state ultimately allows for corporations to consolidate, whether you want to call that corruption
yeah,
or if it's just kind of natural in that sense, is the point that that happens, and the Marx would agree with the libertarian that that happens and that's not good, but they might just have different proposals.
that's a great question. So libertarians will, I've had this argument so many times now. Well, basically they're anti-corporation as well, or they're at least anti
BlackRock, big
they're
corporation.
anti-cronyism.
Yes.
And basically a lot of them will say something to the effect of, well, you wouldn't have these kind of giant monopolistic corporations without the state like
Mhm.
allowing them to exist or enabling them to exist. And yeah, that's true. So if you read Marx's Capital, his big, his kind of, his life's work really, the conclusion of Capital talks about the origins of capitalism. And that's, when he's talking about the origins of capitalism, he sounds like you would expect this to be written by a libertarian. Because Marx
Mm.
really is kind of like a classical liberal in
Mm.
that sense. He's not a liberal in the way people were liberals at the time, because liberalism sort of started to mean something different in the early 19th century. There wasn't really liberalism before the 19th century. There's like everyone that was on the side of this newly emerging society was like liberal in that sense. It
Mm.
wasn't like an ideology. It was just like, this is reality. So when John Locke, for example, writes the treatises on government, it's not like he's saying, hey, isn't this a good idea? Shouldn't we do this? He's saying this is the natural order of society, right? So it's like that. It's not like an idea, shouldn't we do this? Isn't this the right way to do things? It's like
A reflection of what's going on.
a reflection of reality, of like the natural development in a sense of the world at the time. But liberalism in the early 19th century starts to, and again, this is another complicated story I'll leave to the side, but basically Marx is a classical liberal in the sense of he's essentially continuing the same revolutionary project as a John Locke or a Thomas Jefferson or um, you know uh, uh, and so on. So, but in a different context, because things have changed, things have
Hmm.
developed beyond the point they were at that time. So it's really a question of how to further advance this revolutionary project under changed circumstances that arose
Hmm.
from its own relative success, not
Mm.
complete success, but relative success. So in that sense, Marx is very much a classical liberal, and in the conclusion of Capital, he sounds like a libertarian because he's basically saying, the order we live in now came about because these aristocrats that controlled state power, basically they indebted themselves to the point that the bankers took over the state through central banking. So the Bank of England in particular is the core of the whole system that emerges after the 17th century. So that ultimately becomes industrial capitalism, and it has deeper roots. But that's like the kind of that's where it really crystallizes with the Bank of England, and you have this system of plunder through state power that
Mm.
involves colonialization. It involves the national debt. So that's how the banks control the state, is they make the state indebted to them, right? Because I
Mm.
mean, think about it. If you're in
Debt
debt
is
to
slavery.
someone,
Yeah.
and I'm not talking about in like legal terms, like if you're in debt to a loan shark, then you have to do what they say, or they're going to break your legs or just kill you,
Right.
right?
There's
So
the coercive element.
right. So taxation, fiat, what we would think of as like fiat currency, like printing money, out of out of proportion with the actual money reserves, the actual gold reserves or silver reserves, and so on. Like all of this is part of what Marx is calling capitalism. So it literally is exactly what they mean by crony cap, protectionism. Marx is, by the way, always throughout his life pro free trade as revolutionary. So, you know, that's like his perspective.
Maybe he would have been in the Freedom Caucus if he were around today.
Well, so, you know, I think the problem with libertarianism is it's an attempt to go back to the roots of you know, this society, which is good. But I feel like there's a very superficial, generally speaking, understanding of what changed over the course of the 19th century. So that's a big difficulty, because then when I get into these arguments about, well, where does capitalism come from, or cronyism, or whatever you want to call it, where does that come from? The libertarians will say things like, well, the state got involved and screwed everything up with these monopolies and, you know, taxation and all, central banking, all of it.
Right.
And in a sense, Marx agrees, but Marx has a different way of looking at it, because he looks at it as a natural process, a kind of natural historical process of development. Not natural in the sense that it's like necessarily good, but just it's literally happening without anyone deciding it's going to happen. You know, I mean, there's people making decisions, but on the whole, it's like
a spontaneously generating kind of thing. Just
like Adam Smith's invisible hand. You know, it's not from the benevolence of the baker or the brewer or the butcher that I get my food. It's not like they are being charitable. They're in it for themselves. They're trying to make a buck. I'm trying to make a buck, but I'm trying to make a buck so I can eat. And so what ends up happening is they are pursuing their individual self-interest, if you will, as am I. But in the end, everyone benefits, right? There's like this spontaneous outcome that emerges without anyone intending it to happen. And Marx essentially just extrapolates from that and says, yes, but that's not a static situation. It changes over time. And it is also not something that the state is not involved in. The state is part of it. The state doesn't make it happen, but the state itself emerges from those sorts of phenomena in history. And the modern capitalist state emerges from this same sort of phenomenon, but it's, you know, it's not the same. It's not the same as like the state in the 17th century. It's not the same as like like what I was just describing with the Bank of England, because that really just sets the stage for a change. So, you know, the American Revolution is in response to this change in the English government that culminates with the regime of King George III. But part of what they do is they station the standing army in that it was no longer needed because the war with France had come to an end. They station it in the colonies in order to extract tax revenue by force out of the colonists. That's what the whole taxation without representation thing was about. It was about literally like an authoritarian state power all of a sudden shows up, when before they had always been self-organized communities with very little interference from the crown and parliament, with the exception of a few brief periods. So, so, you know, there is this radical change that's already evident in the mid 18th century with like the American Revolution, but it only really comes to fruition in the early 19th century, arguably, with the Industrial Revolution. And so what ends up happening is it's not simply that like the state, as in the aristocrats or the king, or, you know, what have you, or even the bankers. It's not so much that they are controlling everything. That's maybe how it starts, but there's a revolution against that kind of overturns it progressively. So that by the early 19th century, it's the liberals that are in power in England, or at least that have the kind of dominant influence in England. And that doesn't end this situation. It in a sense, the problem keeps growing, even though they've changed the political regime. And then what you end up having is there's kind of a renewed despotism that emerges through the ability of these private these private monopolies. They still are able to exert political power even though it's no longer a despotic monarchy. They're able to do it through democracy, because democracy is sort of hollowed out and turned into a way of getting. So I mentioned Louis Napoleon, the Second French Empire that comes out of the failure of the revolution. How that happens is, originally in the revolution, one of the fundamental demands that led to it in the first place, that overthrew the king, was universal suffrage. Everyone, all men having the vote, universal male suffrage. And that they got, they had the revolution, they implemented that. The revolution goes into crisis, and eventually the legislature is like, we need to stabilize things. We're rolling it back. We're restricting the suffrage with property requirements. And Louis Napoleon's the president, and he says, because they hate him because of what he's doing. So what does he say? Well, to protect the suffrage, I'm overthrowing the republic. So he overthrows the republic, and then he says, okay, so now there's this empire, and we're going to hold a nationwide vote, a nationwide referendum. Do you approve of the empire? And overwhelming support for the empire through universal suffrage. Right. And so in a sense, that's kind of the same thing that we have now. Like, what do we have? We have elections where we just kind of give our approval to a despotic state power that society really doesn't have any control over, at least not in terms of regular people. But there are these giant corporate interests that are bound up together into kind of an integrated system through the global financial system. And it's not just national, it's worldwide, that have essentially unlimited power over every government in the world, at least every one that is like worth having power over, and mainly the United States, of course.
Do you think Marx, so he recognizes a class struggle, right? Anyone who believes what Marx would believe, or anyone on that side of the political aisle, believes in this class struggle that's a result of not only the technology, but the structure of government that allows companies to consolidate?
It's really that society depends on all of these people going to work every day. So how do you make that work? Because they're not just going to work for their own sake. They have to go to work to generate wealth for the whole society to function. So you need people in power that are in a position to make sure that they do as much work as possible to fund this whole operation. It's really, the way they talked about it at the time was, this is the modern form of slavery. We are collectively, the working class are the slaves of the owning class, of the ruling class.
Yeah. And with no ability to escape the slavery. And the libertarian today would say that's just a victim's mindset. And the Marxist or someone on that side would say, no, man, it's a real predicament.
So I would say, victim or not, I think when I think about victim mentality and that sort of thing, which I find as contemptible as anyone else, and so did Marx, by the way. Marx was so I think what that points to, if you're talking about victims, is you're saying, well, someone needs to help them, and generally what you're saying is the state needs to help them. The government needs to help them. They need support. They need the people in power, the people in charge, the people with wealth and power to do something to ameliorate their condition. Otherwise, things are going to keep getting worse and worse. It's going to lead to social instability. It's going to lead to riots. It's going to lead to crime. It's going to lead to social degeneration, and so on. It's going to lead to a breakdown in the economy, ultimately. So you need to do something to stabilize that. You need like a welfare state. Well, where does that come from? That comes from these Bonapartist authoritarian regimes that I was just describing. Louis Napoleon pioneered it, but even more than Louis Napoleon, in the French emperor, is Otto von Bismarck in Germany, who is the chancellor of Germany in the second half of the 19th century, which is also where the socialist movement gets its second footing in the emergence of the German Socialist Party. And what does he do? He basically creates this welfare state in order to. So what he says is, look, the people voting for the socialists, for the social democrats, I'm not worried about that, because all they're really saying is, we want help. And that's just the way they're saying it. So what my idea is, well, let's just buy them off.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that way they're not supporting the liberals that are calling for this, for reforms, for liberal reforms, democratic reforms. They're supporting the state. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's what happens is you have this state socialism, so to speak, may not call itself socialism, but it may, that is essentially using the victim mentality to justify the existence of this bureaucratic machine of repression that operates not just with outright repression. It has a carrot and the stick, right? It's you get the carrot if you obey, and if you don't, you get your head knocked in. So that's what people think Marxism is. And I'm not going to say there isn't reason. There is reason, because there were regimes that called themselves Marxist in the 20th century that operated that way. The question is that what Marx was about? Is that what Marxism originally was looking for, was striving for? Well, I mean, if you read Marx, if you engage with this history, it's very obviously not. So then the question is, what went wrong? If that wasn't what they were aiming for, if that wasn't what they were explicitly trying to do,
well,
why did that
what
result?
were they aiming for?
They were
what
aiming
does
for,
resolution look like?
well, it's what I was just describing before we broke, which was, establishing the democratic republic first and foremost. And if the liberals and, if the bourgeois parties are not going to fight for that, if they're just going to fall in line with the state, then then the working class party has to fight for that alone. But if they are fighting for it, then we stand with them up to that point. And once there is a democratic republic, then it's a struggle within this political and social order for the working class through its organizations to assert their own power in society. So
Marx was after,
in the market.
Marx was after a genuine level playing field. Well, maybe not even the right word, but he was advocating for a genuine cleansing of the state, removing of this. Well, okay, let me try.
Doing away with it. Doing away with it was the phrase he used. Doing away with the existing state and essentially creating a new state in its place, but not
where there's equal power, but actually where the workers have significant power.
Not just the workers, but society, the armed people, regardless of their economic occupation, although the majority of them, of course, are workers, where the workers are the state, literally are, in the sense that they are the men with guns that enforce the law. And then, of course, that doesn't mean there's no government that's separate from them. But that's so, like, if you read like the Federalist Papers, for example, when the American founders are debating the new Constitution, I think it's Federalist 46 or 47. I think I might have mentioned this on Brent's podcast, but that's when there's this concern about this new federal government becoming a despotic, government, because of course there were a lot of concerns about that. The argument that that Madison makes is, but the government isn't going to have any power on its own, because the only armed force in society is the militia, and the government doesn't have the ability to form a standing army. We are not intending to give it that ability, which the Constitution does not give it that ability. And even if it were able to do that, how on earth would any army that the government could raise, how on earth would it be able to stand up to the entire society being an army?
All right.
The entire, at least all the males, all the adult males in society being a military force, the militia. How on earth would it be able to, even if it had its own army, how would it be able to repress society and impose a despotism on it? It wouldn't be able to. It would be impossible. That was the idea. So the government is not the state. The state, the sovereign, is society. And now society kind of lends its sovereign power to this. So I quoted the other day on a tweet of yours, the opening passage from the Declaration of Independence about the government derives its powers from the consent of the governed. And this is what that means. It means literally that we allow the government to operate with sovereignty, with the power of the people behind it, the power of the armed people behind it, so long as it obeys the will of the people.
Basically that's at that statement is at the end of a gun.
Yeah. And if the government is not obeying So if it's not respecting the fundamental liberties, civil liberties, and more generally, if it's like not answering the representatives of the people, or even if the representatives of the people are not answering to their constituents, then
This is an empowered people.
Yeah, that's
And
the
that's
whole.
what Marx wanted as well, an empowered people. So
That's
what
the entire point of it. The entire
Marx
point.
wanted to empower the people and put them in charge, not hand it over to some authoritarian state that requires a tremendous amount of work. And people are so lazy today. And so it's just so interesting, first of all, to understand all this stuff in one moment at a time, and then to try to apply it to the challenges we see today. It's a whole nother ball of yarn, huh?
So I don't think it can be applied straightforwardly today.
Fair.
Because for one thing, Marx took for granted the world that he lived in, as I was saying earlier. And the main phenomenon, the fundamental phenomenon that was kind of at the center of the world at that time, was this emergence of the proletarian socialist movement, the working class socialist movement. And that was what he thought was the most important phenomenon. And so that's what he focused on. But he didn't bring it about. And even, I mentioned how it kind of dissolves and comes back. He wasn't involved in it coming back. When the revolution failed, and there's over a decade of counter revolution, where the revolutionary movement, not just the socialists, but the whole revolutionary movement's kind of scattered and broken apart. Marx just retreats to the British Museum, the library in London, to research his political economy. He's like, I'll wait for society to come back around because I know that inevitably it will. That's just, there's this dynamic in society. It's irresistible that will happen. So, and it did eventually. And he was, then he played a role in that, but he was reluctant to do so because he wasn't sure if is this real or not? Now there's nothing like that at all. Nothing like it at all. There's unions, but the unions are, they're integrated with the crony capitalist system. They're integrated with the corporations, with the state at the top level. Now, there's a lot of good people in unions, and including functionaries. I'm not saying that they're all like bad or something, but they're just part of the system, and they exist to perpetuate themselves. They're conservative in that sense. And it's not like conservatism is bad, but conservatism is bad if what you're trying to conserve is like self-destructing, because then it's like you're not going to conserve it. All you're going to do is get blown up. You're
slowing down the healing process of society, or the reformation process. You're slowing down. If you're conserving something that's decaying, you're strangling society's progress.
Exactly. So there is something to conserve.
You're almost enabling. It's like an enabling friend or parent. You got to let something hit rock bottom.
Right. I mean, there is something to conserve, but it's not the things that are exactly as you put it, constraining the further development. What there is to conserve is the development. What is developing? Where, in other words, what is the source of social progress, of social development? And the working class basically looked at the society they were living in and said, we are the source of that. Our labor is, because without our labor, nothing happens, nothing works. You can have all the machines you want, but the machines do not run on their own. You need people to put fuel in them, to operate them, to oversee them, to repair them. Maybe someday we'll get to a point where machines can be wholly autonomous of any inputs of labor. But I don't think you would get that out of capitalism, which is a whole nother story. I don't know if I went off track from a question or if I've answered a question.
No. Well, no, we don't think we could apply Marx's ideology today straightforwardly for several reasons.
So there is no working class movement. And this is in the 60s. You'll hear people talk about cultural Marxism, this idea that Marxists in the 50s and 60s and 70s were like, oh, well, the working class doesn't seem like they're going to do it. So maybe we should try to have a revolution some other way, like maybe a cultural revolution, maybe a race-based revolution, or a sex-based or a gender-based revolution, or a student-based revolution, or maybe like a criminal-based. There's literally people that are like, oh, we should have the criminals, or the kind of underclass, like the people involved in crime and prostitution and so on. Like maybe they're the revolutionary element. And obviously none of that worked out. And it also confused things immensely, because now now no one really knows what's being talked about when you talk about Marxism, because they think it's that. But the idea that was like an adaptation of Marxism, it is, in the sense that the people that were doing it didn't understand Marxism. And so they were trying to make it make sense by sort of merging it with these different ideas, and that were kind of basically directly
It's not fair
opposed.
to get those and think that you understand Marxism.
In any case, it's a whole different thing.
Right.
But that, so what I would say is, at present, like, I'm not like hopeless, in the sense that I still think that basically what Marx was talking about is still necessary in some form. And maybe it's not for the better, maybe it's for the worse. Maybe Marxism is doomed to fail. Maybe it's inevitable that it will turn into the sort of thing that it did turn into. I'm not saying that's not the case, but if someone wants to argue that, I want to understand the argument. And if you're going to make that argument without actually engaging what Marxism was originally, what Marx actually said and did, and what the Marxists and what the socialist movement more generally was, if you're just going to base that wholly on like these very abstract kind of caricatures that are inherited from the 20th century, not from the 19th century, then I just don't feel like that argument is convincing, because I know I've read all this stuff. I know what was actually going on. At least I certainly have a better idea than a lot of these people that I end up having these discussions with. And if you're right about the argument you're making, then you should be able to make it on the basis of this subject matter that I've familiarized myself with. So if it is inevitable that Marxism leads to this, please show me exactly how and why that's the case based on this history. Because if you're going to just say, well, Marx wanted everyone to be a slave of the state, and so on. Okay, well, where did he say that? Where exactly did that happen? Because I've never come across anything like that. In fact, I've only come across basically the exact opposite of that.
And so, and obviously this means that you didn't see it implied throughout the subtext of any of his ideas. Obviously you don't feel that way.
It's not that it's not implied. It's that it's implied in the sense that it's the tendency of society is leading in that direction. Inevitable. It's just, that's the way things seem to be going, is this concentration of wealth and power at the top that is not only trying to like kind of exploit society like ruthlessly, but it's also trying to preserve this order. So it's not going to push so hard that the whole thing falls apart. I mean, it might end up doing that, but it's not going to try to do that. The people in power are not going to try to have a giant crisis that undermines their own position in society. So they're going to try to hold things together. And that's what they did. And that's what they're still doing. And they're doing it relatively effectively, all things considered, because not only are things more or less still holding together. I mean, really it's wearing thin, but more or less it is. But there is just really no opposition to it at all. That's at least not a serious opposition. There might be ideological opposition. There might be libertarians are opposed to it, for example. But are they really posing a threat?
Right. No organized, legitimate entity, whatever you want to call it, force. If they exist, they've been defeated. They're sleeping. They're resting right now.
If they're emerged like I would support a libertarian party in the sense of like a classical liberal party looking for like restoration of constitutional Republican government. I would totally support that if it was like a serious thing. And I know there are a lot of libertarians that do take that seriously. I know there are a lot that don't as well. But ultimately, the Libertarian Party is just, I mean, running people for public offices is all well and good, but it doesn't do anything on its own. All it does is get a voice out there in a media environment that is wholly controlled by your enemy. So, you're not really moving the needle with that. What is the social basis of that? Like, because what you really need is not just people in Congress or in state legislatures or something. You need a whole kind of movement in society that has people and resources and wealth, and that's developing and advancing and becoming more and more influential and capable of actually making things happen without the government doing it. Right.
Yeah.
That's what you need, and I don't see
Mm.
that from libertarians. And all I can imagine them doing is rallying at best, like business owners, and not like business owners aren't bad people necessarily. Like small business owners certainly are workers in the sense that they have to work for a living, even if they're employing themselves. Right. They're not wage laborers, but they essentially are their own employees as well as employers. Right. So there
Mm.
are some common interests there.
Right.
Um, but then the question is like, are they gonna like actually become like a threat to this authoritarian state that has kind of like usurped political power in this country in an unconstitutional way?
Hmm.
I am skeptical, but it certainly doesn't seem like that's happening at the moment. So if that were happening, I would be like interested. And I do keep
Right.
my eye on the libertarians for that
Right.
reason. But there's no working class movement, and
Right.
the reasons for that are complicated. But I don't think neither I can bring that about, nor can anyone else just from talking about this stuff bring that about.
Mm.
It would have to just develop, and it needs there needs to be people putting the right ideas out there to help catalyze it, but the ideas aren't in and of themselves going to change anything, right? They're
Hmm.
just, if nobody's paying attention, no one's listening, no one's taking them seriously, then they're just more noise. So what I'm most interested in myself is bringing these ideas out there and putting them forward, not so much for like regular working people to latch onto them, because I don't have an audience to do that, but really more to challenge the Marxists that are out there putting Marxism into the world, their version of Marxism into the world, because what they're doing is making everyone think Marxism is horrible and should have failed and shouldn't be taken seriously. They're basically giving people the every reason to not take this history
Mm.
seriously. Which,
Mm.
if I'm wrong about the conclusions to be drawn from this history, that's fine. But I think the failure of socialism was the defining event that is kind of at the foundation of the world we live in today. And that failure was a protracted process over the course of, a century and more than a century now, still ongoing. There's still socialism is still out there failing every day in both the form of like internet Marxists on Twitter, or like Democratic Socialists of America, or Bernie Sanders, or AOC, or the Chinese Communist Party, or European social democracy. All of that stuff comes out of the failure of socialism in one form or another, and it's all part of that failure, and it's all contributing to the failure continuing. Because it's
Mm.
not going anywhere, in my opinion. But what I think can help is understanding where all that stuff comes from. And that means taking the history seriously.
Right.
So I want to get rid, as much as I can, I want to discourage
Hmm.
people that are putting confused, distorted ideas out there, and that have these confused, distorted ideas themselves. And the ones that want to take this history seriously, I want to help them clarify that understanding as best I can. And will that lead to anything? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it's just an idle intellectual exercise. So maybe I'm not political at all. Maybe this is purely a thought experiment or something.
Hmm.
In terms of realistically, politically, in terms of the modern world, where I don't have any support at all for either of the major parties, because they're just both parts of this bureaucratic apparatus of authoritarian repression. They're like the stage performers at the front that are distracting everyone from what's really going on. And some of them are involved in what's really going on. Some of them are just purely like patsies that have no idea. And some of them start out with good intentions and end up being either alienated and marginalized, or leaving the political arena altogether, or they become corrupted by it.
Mm.
So, I just don't have any faith in any of that. The Libertarian Party, as I said, I think is interesting in principle, at least up to a point. But
But if they're
it's
all into individual rights, doesn't that leave you wanting something more as someone from the left? If the libertarian is all about the individual's rights should be supreme, doesn't the leftist view say, hey, all individuals have a responsibility to link up and participate in a meaningful way in society. So the individual is extremely important in both situations. But even if there's not a centralized state in the idealized Marxist or socialist or communist, whatever we want to call it, leftist view, there is this idea that there's some social organization, intentional social organization that each individual needs to engage in. That's a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, so this gets at a whole nother question, which is related to everything we've been talking about, which is left and right and how we use those terms now
Yeah.
and where they come from and how they've changed. And I wouldn't put left the way exactly you put it. I mean, it certainly makes sense in terms of the way people use the term now. But I don't, to the extent that like socialism is part of the history of the left politically, that's not, it's not like social obligations versus individual liberties or something. It's really more complicated than that, but it's also simpler than that because the left was so you've probably seen this thing where it's like the four quadrants with like left and right, which is supposed to be like about economics or something. Like I guess like collectivism versus individualism, although there's obviously a lot of collectivism on the right, so I don't really know how people square it that way.
Sure.
In terms of like hard right wing stuff, and then authoritarian libertarian. So the weird thing about that is like really it should be one axis and the left should be libertarian and the right should be authoritarian. That's what it was historically.
Right.
The right was tradition. It was the ruling classes are the ruling classes because they should be the ruling classes. The existing social hierarchies are it's not just that hierarchy is good. It's that the hierarchies that exist should exist because, whatever the explanation. They're ordained by God, or they are just the most pragmatic, or whatever. And the left was not about it's not about society versus the individual or the collective versus the individual or like equality versus liberty. It was about the liberty of the individual. And that's what Marx was all about. People don't understand this, but again, this is the entire point, is that capitalism was depriving the working class of their individual liberties. And the whole point, so there's like a line in the Communist Manifesto at the end of the second chapter. People always get hung up on the things they don't understand in the Communist Manifesto because they're reading it as if the words mean what they mean today instead of what they meant at the time. But the ending of the second chapter, Marx basically says what the working class is fighting for is a society in which the free development of each individual is the condition for the free development of society, of all individuals. So in other words, it's a more thoroughgoing concern with individual liberty than is already manifest in that sense, than is already possible under the existing social order. So, and I could give you countless examples of this, but basically it's not about that. It's really about revolution in the sense of moving forward with this process of emancipation of society versus holding it back, whether out of caution or out of reaction against it. So like reactionary, like wanting to go back to an older form, or just a kind of milquetoast conservatism that's like, I just want to go about my business and I don't want all this crazy stuff happening, So like I'll put up with some restrictions on my freedom if I can just, go about my business or whatever. So that's really, I think, that's how I would think about the left right thing. And it's complicated. There's a whole history that really needs to be better understood.
It's a question of, do you think there is a natural progress happening, or is change? This is what a conservative and a progressive today would argue about on the most rudimentary level. They would say, well, the progressive would say, no, man, change is good. It's happening. Not only is it good, it's happening, so we need to embrace it and ride the wave, dude. You got to ride the wave. Whereas a conservative would say, no, it doesn't need to happen. We don't need to change.
Well, so that's another interesting point as well, because there's this phenomenon now, progressivism, and it goes back to the early 20th century. It goes back to Theodore Roosevelt, but really Woodrow Wilson. it's really Theodore Roosevelt kind of is the first political figure in the United States that's like really pushing this new idea, which he calls his form of conservatism, interestingly. But Woodrow Wilson is really and then even more so than Woodrow Wilson, FDR. But it really is those three and that whole period. But it's really that phenomenon. And so, what is progressivism? Because it's not, the left isn't just about going with the flow of history in that sense, right? Because the point isn't simply that it's not like progress is good. Progress is good and bad. It has a lot of good things about it and a lot of bad things. What is progressing? It's not just the good parts of society that are progressing. The bad parts are also progressing. So the bad things are getting worse and the good things are getting better at the same time. And of course, also sometimes the good things go bad and the bad things become good, but it's more complicated than that. So progress is more about change than it is about like approaching some sort of ideal, because it's not like there's not somebody that's deciding what the change is going to be. So what the left is about historically is not so much about simply going with the change. It's about society being able to freely determine how it changes. So instead of things changing on their own, like in a way that people can't control, the changes happen in a way that they want them to happen.
The left, the left, the movement historically of the left is to say, we see the change and we're going to grab our hands out and try to be a part of it because we want to steer this ship. We want to try.
Right. Exactly. And that's what political liberty and political equality was all about. It was about having the ability to participate in the kind of overall decision making of society, the political decision making of society, in a way that as things are changing, all of the people that are affected by those changes are able to help determine how society navigates this process of change.
It's a declaration of right.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's, again, that's something that is not really well understood.
And you could look at and you could project, in our society today, and we're just beginning with this amazing conversation to understand where the furniture is in the room. That's what the phrase they used at my law school orientation so many years ago. First year, you're just going to see where the furniture is.
So in terms of today, and again, getting back to the Libertarian Party, which you had asked me about, I don't think it's, I have a lot of antipathies about it because of, I don't think it's like, well, let me just put it this way. I haven't been sold on its seriousness, but if it were serious about at least some of the things that it claims to be serious about, I would be more interested, and I keep my eye on it for that reason. But I think what we really need, one way or another, whatever it, wherever it comes from, whatever it's called, we need a real opposition party, a real party of opposition to the existing state, to both of the ruling parties, which are really one party with two heads. And we really need a voice of opposition on behalf of society to represent that opposition to the people in power and to catalyze that opposition among the people in society, because it's very widespread. There's a lot of, at least, disillusion, if not outright anger and contempt for the way things are running and the people in charge, but it doesn't have a voice. It doesn't have an expression.
It's so interesting that you speak about your willingness to participate in a unification process. It doesn't matter if you want to call me a Marxist or a libertarian.
I'll take what I can get right now.
Perhaps there's more common ground than there is not common ground. And regardless, things are bad enough to where you're willing to say, hey, dude, I'm open-minded. Let's team up and take down the system. That would be a worthwhile project. So
I would say any party that is unwilling to collaborate with the ruling party and the state, that is standing in opposition to it. And so not like looking to get people elected to cut a deal to get this or that, but that are there to say, we need to fundamentally change things. And the real fundamental change I'm talking about is restoring the republic, restoring the constitutional order that has really been usurped. Oh, I mentioned progressivism. So what was progressivism? It was like the usurpation of constitutional government by
Yeah.
this authoritarian
Right.
political bureaucracy that is unaccountable to the people. It's unelected. It is in control of all of the
So
real
what you're
levers of
saying is
power.
music to the libertarian or even the conservative's ears. So my question to you would be,
Yeah.
what value do you see in shifting back to that original minimal government, democratic, constitutional republic? What value do you see in that?
Well, at the very least, it would. So, you know, in terms of going back to that, I'm not under any illusions that that's like an easy thing, or it may not even be possible in like at least the straightforward way I'm thinking about it here. It might be messier than that. I don't know. I
I
mean, who
guess you're
knows?
talking about just sucking the corporate power out of the government.
At least having my number one concern at the moment, if I were able to do anything politically, if I were able to have any influence, sort of playing risk at the moment, but you know, the real concern would be to have an opposition, a political opposition that can bring together all of the opposition that already exists in society and help develop it. So not just like agitate it in the sense of getting people really angry. I'm not looking for like demagogy. I'm not looking for people to get just people riled up and like with their pitchforks or something, because that won't go anywhere. That'll end with like, I mean, we had massive riots a few years ago across the country, and that's not a good thing. I'm not interested in that. You know, I mean, if people break out into riots because they're so angry, I guess I can kind of understand that, but that's not something I'm trying to make happen. I don't want that to happen. What I would rather happen is that those people channel that energy into more productive ways of trying to deal with the problem. And the real sort, like the level at which this problem affects normal people for the most part, is the deterioration of social life. I mean, social life, I feel like just in the last 4 years since the pandemic, but I mean, it really has been going on longer than that, but it's been especially pronounced in the last 4 years. It just feels like society hardly even exists. It feels like you're in this like encampment where you have to go from like, you know, like you have to go from like unit to unit to like get what you need and then leave and then go back to isolation. You know, and it's like seems like there's hardly any of, you know, social life is like deteriorating. Like if you are out in society, it's like there's a lot of disorder, there's a lot of you know, I don't know, I'm being very general. I don't know if people can kind of intuit what I'm talking about, but I feel like there's very obviously been a replacement of the sort of fabric of social life that used to exist with essentially this kind of corporatized system of like, you know, you're kind of like an atom being shuffled around between these different mechanisms of control.
Go here for this, go there for that. And
Yeah.
it's like, am I really in control of my life?
Can I have a conversation with a stranger?
Right.
Are people like gathering together to do things? I mean, I know that kind of stuff still happens, but it's just, it seems like that whole, and you know, there's research to back this up as well. I mean, it's been that the fabric of society has been deteriorating in that sense in terms of like voluntary association, you know, people just voluntarily associating with each other in various forms. It's been replaced by this like infrastructure of corporate control and political control that most people have no you know, have no power over whatsoever, no influence over whatsoever. So, you know, I would like to see something that addresses that problem, both in the sense of representing opposition to the people in charge that are behind all of this stuff happening, but also trying to like address these problems through their own voluntary forms of association, and bringing back some sort of substance to social life that is kind of missing now.
It's such an
You know,
interesting, yeah, and that's actually a really fascinating place to probably land this plane, and it just underlines what the left and the right would have in common is this sense of responsibility. You got to participate,
yeah,
whether you want
yeah,
whether you want anarchy. Guess what? Why is Brent's podcast? He's an anarchist called Aiming Up because he understands that the individual needs to aim up and do better
yeah,
if anarchy is to succeed, or if you're a communist and you believe that in some form or another, mass organization, even at a local level, is necessary, guess what? That requires individual participation and courage. So, and you're talking about, especially since the pandemic, is feeling that that has been suppressed and disincentivized. And yeah, I mean, we are living in bizarro times since the pandemic, so it does feel weird, but it's really interesting to make that connection between the feeling in society now since that pandemic and how important that is, that connection, that social fabric is to whatever the solution is going to be.
Yeah.
It requires that strong social fabric. So
Yeah,
wow.
you know, people, this deterioration has been going on for some time. If you look back at how people used to live, it's a lot different. I mean, just 50 years. I mean, even, I feel like even when we were kids, I don't know if you appreciate this the way I do, but I just feel like things seem like they've gotten worse since then in
Yeah.
this respect. So,
Yeah.
and I know
Hmm.
that they have since, say, the 50s or
Hmm.
even going back to the early 20th century. So
the more you corporatize, the more you aggregate power, to kind of summarize everything up, the more you do this at the top, the problems build up at the bottom.
yes,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And
But
so,
maybe the solution is also accumulating at the bottom, right? Maybe because who's going to change all of that? It
right.
would have to be the people at the bottom. But then the question is, how do you bring that
How do you
together?
structure that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's why
That's
I think
fascinating. Oh my goodness.
you need a kind of locus of opposition to do that. That's my sense of it anyway.
Yeah. If you, whether it's this, that, or the other particular solution of how to solve that problem without an organized locus, as you say, of opposition, nothing's happening. So
I don't think so.
what should happen first, the chicken or the egg? The concentration of opposition or the refinement of the ideas? Doesn't matter. I guess they both need to happen.
They need to happen, and people that are people need to talk about this stuff and
You,
not do so in a superficial and juvenile way. You know,
my guest yesterday that I had on created a website called Egora, and he would love, I'm sure, to have a person like you participate. It's a place where you can basically present your opinions, change your opinions, engage with people in various different ways, and so that is a tool. He comes from the International Logic Party. I want to say that's left by today's standards, and so he's trying to build a tool that would allow people to organize. Actually, it's very interesting. It's kind of a happy coincidence that these were back to back. Yeah, Igor. Oh man, if you had the time and interest in participating, he would, explode in his pants. Excuse me.
That's one of the difficulties is who has
the
time.
Exactly.
Unless you're getting paid to do what
unless
you're doing.
getting paid, and that is kind of relevant, right? I mean, you put in a guy like you puts in so much work, and you've got limited resources.
Yeah, I have a day job. I mean,
yeah. So it's fascinating. Reid, this has been amazing. Thank you so
it's been
much.
great talking, Brian. And anytime I'd love to talk again if you would.
I'd be more than willing. I'd be excited. I'm looking forward to that.